Hi everybody, just a very short video this week. I've been away, but I wanted to get something done on the Bismarck. So I wanted to build these 20mm quad guns mountings. I've already built one. There are just two on the ship and they go on the searchlight platform on the upper bridge which I constructed last time. So just some equipment here to add to that assembly. As you can see, the assembly here is made up from a few trumpeter parts, 3 trumpeter parts I think it is, and a number of photo etch and the barrels in turned brass as well from the Pontos set. There is a bit of an issue in the Pontos set which we'll come on to, and that relates to the magazine racks here on either side of the gun. You can see them down at the bottom. There's quite a lot to do with these, and the most difficult thing really is aligning the 4 gun barrels, which is pretty essential when you're building something like this. Very fine gun barrels like this will accentuate any error that you've got in the build or in alignment, and it just throws the whole thing out. So it's just important to get those lined up. Looking at the anatomy of the ship volume, you can see this is the gun that we're building. It's a 2cm 20mm C38 gun in a quadruple or Vierling mounting, and this is quite useful for helping us with the very poor Pontos instructions, which we're getting used to now, but the anatomy of the ship just gives us some better clues about where some of the finer Pontos parts go. So we've got the line drawings as well, both for front, back and side profiles here. So altogether the anatomy of the ship book comes into its own building these very fine Pontos assemblies. So the first job is to get the trumpeter parts out, glue some of them together. We need to do a little bit of modification on them, and then we'll make a start with the Pontos bits. So I'll correct myself, it's actually 4 trumpeter parts, I thought it was 3. These are the trunnions. Just clean these up a little bit. We need to remove some of the trumpeter moulding. This is the plastic moulding that holds the trumpeter barrels in place and aligns them. But we have to do away with those when we're using the Pontos set. So I'll put the 2 trunnions together. Just get them lined up. I've got the guns at a slight angle upwards, but it doesn't really matter which angle, I don't think, as long as the 2 sides are at the same angle. Just let that set. This is the pedestal that the gun sits on. Those are the trumpeter parts prepared. I'll get the first of the Pontos pieces, which is the gun platform. That's this piece. And that simply glues onto the bottom of the mounting. Just make sure that it's orientated the correct way. Before that sets, I'll add the pedestal as well, and that'll trap the photo etch in position. These little extensions here on the side, they're for the seats eventually, but I'm not going to bend those up just yet. It just adds to the risk of folding them, and eventually they'll snap off, so just leave them where they are for the time being. Next I want to put the gun barrels together, so we need 4 breeches, and 4 barrels. The breeches are a simple fold, so they just go into a tray really. And there are a couple of tiny tabs on either end which have to be folded inwards. They just provide a support for the gun barrel and give it the correct angle in the tray. And that's it, that's all there is to that. Obviously the other 3 to do. Those tabs are important, they're very tiny, but they are important in holding the gun at the correct, or the gun barrel at the correct position. There are our 4 barrels. Now these need to go onto the sides of the trunnions here, but before I fit them I want to make sure there's enough clearance for the ammunition trays which fit onto the base plate here, and that comes on to the problem that I referred to at the beginning of the video, and that is that Pontos only provide 2 ammunition trays in the photo etch, and there were 2 per gun, so we're obviously too short. I fitted the 2 that Pontos provided here on the first one that I built, so there's one either side. What I'm going to have to do is rob a pair of trays from the single 20mm mountings. Pontos provide 12, I think it is, and I only need 10. The refit version that I'm building just had 10 single 20mm, so I can afford to use 2 of these. They're a slightly different shape to the 20mm quad parts, but it's all I've got. I'm going to have to use them. I think at this size they're not going to look too out of place. And certainly not as out of place as not having any ammunition racks on at all. So we'll go ahead and use these parts. And I'm putting these racks together because they will determine the level of the first or lower gun. So if I put them together now and mount them, I'll then be able to fit the lower gun so that it's going to go in okay. These ammunition racks are fairly tricky to put together. It's just because of the size really. The individual dividers have to go in as well, and it makes it quite difficult to get these parts together. There are some very small tabs on these dividers, which are these parts. You can just see it on the end of my finger there. I'll get some close-ups of these assemblies when they're done. It's virtually impossible to get them on camera. We'll just fit the ammunition racks on first. That'll just make sure that I can get them in the right position underneath the lower gun. The ammunition trays in position. I can fit the lower of the guns now. So I'm just fitting the guns to either side, and that just means that I can line them up, get them nice and straight, parallel with each other. Before I put the top barrels in, there is a plate which fits on the front. It's got a couple of holes in it for the barrels to go through, so that determines the gap between the upper and lower guns. So I just need to get those ready to go on. These really were curved, but it's very difficult to put a curve on a part with two holes through it, a very fine piece of brass like that, because it tends to fold around the hole in the brass. But it gives an approximation of a curve, so it's not too bad. So slip the plate over the lower gun, and if I then push the other barrel through for the second gun, a bit of glue, and I can then get those into position like that, and we've then got the correct distance between the two. Just make sure that the guns all protrude at the same distance. I'm going to have to invest in some new tweezers. I think these are getting very worn. So that's probably the next purchase on the list. Decent pair of tweezers are absolutely essential for this sort of work. You can't do it without. These are surgical grade tweezers, but I've had them a long time, and because they're so fine, they tend to get bent at the ends a little bit, which these have, so they've lost the grip. I did last year get a very cheap set of tweezers. I think there were about 7 or 8 different types in the packet, but they're no good really for work like this. And I suppose in a way, looking back, they're a bit of a false economy. So I've got the 4 guns in, all parallel, nice and straight, coming out from the same distance. So I'll just leave those to set up before we do anything else with this gun. This is the connecting rod, which ensured that the gun sights travelled in line with the barrels. Next up, we've got 3 seats to fit. These just have some backrests that fold up. And actually these backrests were slightly curved, but I'm not going to try and replicate that. There's every possibility that that would just involve bending them out of shape completely, so I'm not going to do that. And at this stage, you remember these little tabs on the side which I left unfolded. Now it's time to bend those upwards. The seat sits on a little tab at the top. And the last one goes at the back. A little bit awkward to set up, but for me the trick is to just wait until the glue starts to bond before you mess about repositioning it. Once the glue has set, you can then just do any tiny little adjustments to the backs or the positioning of them until you're happy with it. So that's all good. The last thing I've got to do is to fit the sights, and there are a couple of training wheels to go on as well. So there's an elevation wheel on top, just ahead of the rear seat, and one just below it, which is the elevation wheel. There's not a lot of room for these. The Trumpeter plastic doesn't really represent what these guns look like in this area, so you've just got to get them on as best you can. The gun sight has a ring sight at the front and an aiming sight at the back. They just need to be folded, and then that just positions on the back of the Trumpeter plastic arm. Again, it's a bit awkward to get located, but it just hangs underneath the plastic bar on the top of the gun. Like that, all done. And again, just leave the glue to, I'll just leave that glue to dry. Make sure it's a solid connection, and then I'll just make some adjustments to the sights. I nearly forgot to fit the magazines. I suppose with these you could fit the magazines into the racks or directly onto the guns, and I'm going to do the latter. I don't think there's quite enough space in the racks to fit these magazines in. These are just a 180-degree bend in the photo etch, and I don't bother to glue the two halves of the bend together because you're applying glue, super glue, to the open end, so it kind of holds itself together really. And we'll just position those on the breech. I've not been looking forward to doing these. I've anticipated them to be quite difficult, but actually they've gone together reasonably well. Apart from the glitch that Pontos threw our way with the ammunition racks, the actual construction's not too bad. I think probably on a build like this a fairly complex, large ship build. The daunting thing is often doing the weaponry, because there's quite a bit of multiples on them, but actually the armament on the Bismarck isn't as big as, for example, a lot of US or Japanese Navy vessels, which had a lot more anti-aircraft on most of them. But this is probably about enough for me. With the 10 single 20mm, we've got the 8 twins and this pair of quads. So there's plenty to be going on with. On top of that, we've got the main armament. So there's plenty to keep you busy on a build like this. Again, with an assembly like this, where we're putting these magazines onto the guns, the key thing is to try and get them balanced out, because even at this scale and at this size, if you've got them slightly out of alignment, they do tend to stand out a bit. So it's worth just concentrating on where those parts are going. So those are the guns done. Got both of the mountings there, and we'll get some close-ups of those and get them painted, starting off with a coat of primer. So I've just used some Mr. Surfacer 1500 there, thinned around about 50% with Mr. Hobby levelling thinners, and that gives a nice coverage, but when you're painting and undercoating very fine photo etch like this, you don't want to have anything too heavy. Otherwise you just lose the detail that you've applied. So that nice thin coat just does the job. So we'll get some Tamiya XF19 onto that next as the base grey colour for the upper part of the ship, and then we'll do a bit of detail painting. With the XF19, it's a colour which is very similar to Mr. Surfacer Grey, so there's not an awful lot of difference between the two. I'm spraying at about 12 psi. And again, the Tamiya acrylics thinned about 50% with Tamiya Retarder lacquer thinners. And the airbrush is my Harder and Steenbeck Infinity. This has got a 0.4mm nozzle in it. Okay, now it's time for some detail painting. The XF19's gone on and is now dry. And I'm going to start off using some Tamiya lacquer. This is LP16 wooden deck tan. I'm just going to use that for the footboards on the platform. I like painting with Tamiya lacquers. Give a nice smooth finish. putting a slightly different grey on the seats. It's a grey-green colour. It's actually XF76, which is a Japanese Navy colour actually. And it's not particularly that I'm after complete accuracy with that. I just want to pick the seats out just to bring them out a little bit more, just to bring that little detail out. So the last thing we have to do is to paint the guns themselves and the magazines in black. And for that I've got some Mr. Hobby H77. This is tyre black, so it's a slightly off black, or a very, very dark grey. Again, if you're brush painting very fine photo etch like this, I just like to make sure that the paint's well thinned. And try not to work the paint too much, otherwise it'll just clump up and spoil the detail. Okay, I think that's alright. Just need to make sure you're getting all the little nooks and crannies and into the detail. But with a fine brush, a good brush like this, that's not hard to do. Okay, I'm happy enough with those. So it's another job done, one that I wasn't really that much looking forward to, but they turned out a little bit easier than I'd expected, and they're a nice result, I think, with the Pontos extra parts on them. So I'll put those into storage, and we'll get them out next time when I want to fit the rest of the equipment onto the bridge. Get the bridge completely finished up, apart from the foremast, and I'll be doing that next time. So things like the searchlights and the rest of the bridge equipment, other bits and pieces on there. There's a way to go yet before the bridge is finished, but we'll get that done next time in episode 20. So that'll put us back on track next week after a short break for me, and we'll move the build on. I'm also going to be doing some work on the Zukimura 109 as well this week, and hopefully we'll get the cockpit done and get part 2 of that build series out as well. So I hope you can join me for one of those, everybody. In the meantime, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.